Hey, thanks for coming. Welcome to the Socratic Club, this special postponed meeting of the Socratic Club. I usually talk a little bit about the background of the Socratic Club. We've existed on the Gonzaga campus now this is our 18th year. The Socratic Club takes its name from the Oxford Socratic Club that was presided over by well-known Christian apologist and author C.S. Lewis. In another life, in addition to being a writer and an author known for Christian children's fiction, the Narnia books, and in his time, he was known for Christian apologetics with books like Mere Christianity and The Problem of Pain. But he also was a university professor at Oxford. He taught in the literature department, in the English literature department. And the Oxford Socratic Club was devoted to providing a forum for people to talk about critical questions having to do with the Christian worldview, broadly speaking. So they did things on like theological problems, arguments for God's existence, arguments about materialism, and so forth. And so that's our model. And as I said, we've been on the Gonzaga campus now for 18 years. I usually also identify the speaker. I am the speaker tonight, doing a presentation on Kierkegaard and Sartre on human nature and the self-definition. I've been at Gonzaga now for a little over 30 years in the philosophy department, and I'm interested in philosophy of human nature. Universities like Gonzaga, Jesuit universities like Gonzaga, typically offer a course in the human person or human nature. Gonzaga's had such a course in the core curriculum for a long time, longer than I've been at Gonzaga. And we have a series, the Gonzaga Socratic Club, this semester, and actually the most of last semester, we've been running a series on human nature, topics in human nature. So this is part of that. And so with that, I'll just proceed and start the presentation. It's going to take about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion as we normally do at the Socratic Club. So thanks for coming. Glad you're here. All right. What I want to talk about tonight is the relationship between what I think about myself and what I am. I don't know how much you've thought about this question, but how do I define myself? How do I conceive of myself? As one way that we'll talk about this before we're done is, how do I represent myself to myself? How do I think about my own identity? What relation does that have to what I am? Many modern thinkers collapse these two questions and assert that the self just is what it thinks it is. I'm going to argue that this idea and the way the question is framed is a vestige of existentialism, is really drawn from some existentialist ideas, especially, I'm going to argue, Kierkegaard and Sartre, as very important figures in this in the development of this idea and this way of framing the question of thinking about myself or identifying myself or conceiving of myself. The key thing I want to claim is that the question concerns the relationship between philosophical anthropology on the one hand, which is human nature or what the human being is, and philosophical psychology on the other hand, the human capacity to think about, represent, and define the self. I plan in this talk to investigate the relationship between the self and the self's conception of itself. There's a technical aspect of the talk, even though we're talking about a subject that I think is already in kind of the public consideration, or we find it versions of it in popular culture and so forth. I'm going to take a somewhat technical approach and look at the views of two opposed philosophers, Søren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, who lived from 1813 to 1855, and Jean-Paul Sartre, famous French existentialist philosopher who lived from 1905 to 1980. But I want to take this technical approach to address the question in a practical way as well. My basic contrast is really between Kierkegaard's conception of how the self represents itself and Sartre's. Kierkegaard argues that the self-representation is built on a foundational nature, and that ignoring this nature is one form of what Kierkegaard calls a misrelation of the self to itself, or what he calls despair. Sartre, by contrast, argues that the self-representation is not based on a nature, because there is no human nature in a critical sense. Sartre wants to argue that it's an expression of radical freedom. Now, I'm actually going to complicate that picture. By the time we're done, I'm going to say Sartre doesn't quite actually believe that, but I'm going to argue that Kierkegaard's view is closer to the truth here. It's important to start with just a basic contrast between philosophical anthropology, which concerns, it's a discipline, sometimes called philosophy of human nature. It's a discipline that's concerned with examining human nature, or what we might call the pre-given conditions of human existence. And the contrast to that is, in my title, is philosophical psychology. Philosophical psychology investigates the human project of representing, defining, or constructing the self. Now, notice philosophical psychology is not the same thing as the social science that we know of as psychology, which is a largely empirical study of human behavior and mental and social activity. The focus in philosophical psychology is especially on the power of the self to represent itself to itself. It's characterizing or representing itself, or conceiving of itself, thinking of itself. That's the focus that we're going to take. And philosophical psychology often, maybe a good example of this is in tribal animism. Often a person will identify himself or herself by a totem, by a particular spirit animal that's related to the tribe. A popular way of thinking of this is how sports fans identify, and they say, I'm a Seahawk, or I'm a Saint, or whatever your favorite sports team is. In other words, self-representation often has to do with the position of the self with respect to a group, but not always. Sometimes it has to do with the self's definition of itself in contrast to groups. I don't know why, but my slideshow keeps advancing itself and moving itself around. Okay. Let's see. All right. While there are hints of the human capacity for self-representation in ancient and medieval thought, for example, Socrates' focus on self-examination. Socrates famously said, the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. The idea of investing the self, Stoic rigorous self-governance, or the Christian notion of self-examination and repentance. The idea of the self investigating itself by meditation or reflection is something that doesn't really clearly emerge until modernity, especially early modernity. We find versions of it in the philosophical and literary work of authors such as Montaigne, Bunyan, Defoe, Descartes, Pascal, Hume, and Rousseau, all of whom are concerned with plumbing the depths of the self and what it means to be a self and what the self is. However, after this period, roughly in the 16 and 1700s, the self increasingly becomes a central focus of thinkers in the 18th and 19th centuries. And since then, it's been ubiquitous as an intellectual and academic theme, and indeed as a preoccupation of popular culture. I would say one of the big concerns in popular culture is, how do I think of myself? How do I define myself? What is myself? Self, as I've indicated already by saying I'm going to focus on Kierkegaard and Sartre, Self is a particularly important theme in Kierkegaard, in the philosophy of Kierkegaard, and through Kierkegaard in existentialists such as Heidegger and then Sartre, and also more broadly in the continental or phenomenological tradition. I'm going to start with a famous, I might even say famously notorious passage from one of Kierkegaard's books, The Sickness Unto Death. And this is a rich and indeed maddening passage of an important book that is convoluted, it's confusing, it's difficult, and some people actually think it's so crazy that it's probably intended by Kierkegaard to be a joke, to be a kind of parody. But I think there's actually some seriousness in what he's saying here. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just to give you a sense of the flavor, a human being is spirit. But what is spirit? Spirit is the self. But what is the self? The self is a relation that relates itself to itself, or is the relations relating itself to itself in the relation. The self is not the relation, but is the relations relating itself to itself. A human being is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity. In short, a synthesis. A synthesis is a relation between two. Considered in this way, a human being is still not a self. Actually, I'm going to read a little further. In the relation between two, the relation is the third as a negative unity, and the two relate to the relation, and in the relation to the relation. Thus, under the qualification of the psychical, the relation between the psychical and the physical is a relation. If, however, the relation relates itself to itself, this relation is the positive third, and this is the self. Okay, as I said, maddening, difficult, convoluted. Let me identify a couple of things. We could do a whole talk just on this passage, but I want to point out a couple of things that Kierkegaard is saying here. The self is the human project of self-relation. It is a self-relating relation. The mode of self-relation is self-representation, how the self characterizes itself to itself. And so when Kierkegaard talks about the human, the self relating itself to itself, what he means is that the self represents itself. It thinks of itself. It projects a certain conception of what it is to itself. As he says, the self is a synthesis, or it emerges from a dialectical contrast between polar opposites. He talks about the infinite and the finite, the temporal, the eternal, freedom and necessity. And what he's really getting at there is a contrast between aspects of openness of the self. There are avenues opened out for the self's conception of itself. And then finitude, temporality, and necessity have to do with givenness or closedness of the self. As he says, the self doesn't consist in the bare fact of synthesis, the dialectic or tension between polar opposites. In fact, he says this is a negative unity, but the self consists in how the relation relates itself to itself. Specifically, the self represents itself to itself as falling on a continuum defined by this range of possibilities of infinitude and eternality and freedom on the one hand, and necessity and temporality and finitude on the other hand. As I say, there's so much more we could say about this, but I'm going to have to leave it at that. And we'll proceed on and see if we can make some sense of this. Now, Kierkegaard would argue that the self as spirit replicates and rests on a more foundational relation, that between what he calls in the passage that we were looking at, the psychical or the mental, and the physical or the bodily. In other words, Kierkegaard is saying the power of the self to represent itself to itself is based on its being a certain kind of organism. So self-relation is only possible, self-relation and self-representation is only possible because human beings are constituted in a specific way, namely capable of self-relating self-representation. This capacity is as Kierkegaard says, man's superiority over the animal. And this superiority distinguishes him in quite another way than does his erect walk, for it indicates infinite erectness or sublimity, that he is spirit. So notice what Kierkegaard is claiming here, right? In our biological nature, we would say that human beings are distinguished from other animals, especially primates, by our erect walk. And that's an indication of being an organism of a certain kind. So Kierkegaard wants to claim that what he's calling spirit, or this capacity to represent the self to itself, to actually ask the question, what am I, is really another way to get at what he's saying. That humans uniquely are beings that do that. We ask, what am I? We ask, how should I conceive of myself? How should I understand myself? And so that's a unique dimension of human nature, he would say. This capacity of humans to represent ourselves is a capacity that's grounded in us being beings of a certain kind. Now, Kierkegaard in Sickness Unto Death doesn't specify what his underlying theory of human nature is. I would argue that it's a broadly Aristotelian hylomorphic hylomorphic view. I think this is a claim I can defend. It would take another 45 minutes for me to talk about that. That would be a different talk, so that's not what I'm going to talk about tonight. And it's not really essential to what I'm trying to say, because the general point I want to make is that the self is in fact grounded on a foundational human nature. The self, or this dynamic activity of self-relation and self-representation, is thus not free-floating. It's not just a bare fact about human experience, but Kierkegaard argues it rests on the nature or ontology or metaphysics of the human person. Only beings of a certain kind can represent themselves to themselves, or can relate themselves to themselves. I think Kierkegaard is aware of this point, as he indicates by the subtitle of the book. It's subtitled A Christian Psychological Exposition for Upbuilding and Awakening. So Kierkegaard's demonstrating that he knows that in talking about the self and offering an account of the self as self-relating and self-representing, he's arguing that the self falls into the domain of philosophical psychology. So what Kierkegaard is you could say, in this case, he's positing, because he's really interested in talking about the nature of self-representation and how it works. He's positing that the capacity of self-representation, the sphere of philosophical psychology, is grounded in human nature. That is, us being constituted, human beings being constituted as a particular sort of living thing. That is, human selfhood is grounded in human nature, or philosophical psychology is grounded in philosophical anthropology. Now, the power of the self to represent itself to itself is in potentiality a good insofar as it reflects human superiority over animals, which cannot represent themselves to themselves. Or to put it another way, the self is not a problem for animals because they don't have selves. They don't have selves in the way that we do. That is, they don't represent themselves to themselves. They don't have a self that is a problematic, a problem for itself. But the power of the self to represent itself is also at the root of human freedom, which has to do with our willed agency, not only to represent the self, but also to act in ways that reflect competing conceptions of the self. And I think a helpful analogy for what Kierkegaard's talking about here is the cliche of an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder, as I'm thinking about what am I going to do? Of course, when I face a task that is a stark contrast between two alternatives, I often think of terms of, well, do I go with the angelic self? Do I go with the diabolical self? And so my choice is a free choice. It's a choice that I can make to do something. But Kierkegaard wants us to see that a choice to do something always reflects a choice to be something. The self in choosing to act, the self in exercising its freedom, is always also at the same time representing itself to itself and affirming, indeed in this case, affirming oneself or one potential self against other potential selves. So our capacity to represent ourselves to ourselves is an enormous benefit, an enormous potentiality, an enormous power. But it's also an evil, Kierkegaard says, because the free power of the self to represent itself to itself is nonetheless, in actuality, a terrible thing, because the self inevitably misrepresents itself to itself or misrelates itself to itself, is another way that Kierkegaard talks about this. But this misrelation of the self to itself is what Kierkegaard calls despair. Indeed, despair is the key theme of the book. The title of the book is The Sickness Unto Death. And the despair is what Kierkegaard calls the sickness unto death, drawing from a parable, actually from a story in the New Testament, in the Gospels, when Lazarus is sick and Jesus and the disciples are talking about Lazarus being sick, and they make reference to the sickness unto death. And Kierkegaard wants to say that the sickness unto death isn't the same thing as dying. The sickness unto death, or despair, is a worse condition than dying in some respects, because it's the power of the self to gnaw at itself, to be unhappy with itself, to be dissatisfied with the ways that it represents itself to itself and with the choices that it makes. Now, Kierkegaard is a Christian author. As I mentioned, the subtitle of the book is A Christian Psychological Reflection for Upbuilding. And so he wants to say that despair can only be eradicated by faith. In relating itself to itself and in willing to be itself, the self rests transparently in the power that established it. Now, these are all very super interesting topics, but I can't say more about them because we're going in a different direction. So I just wanted to sketch out for you, Kierkegaard is a kind of, Kierkegaard is a modern point of reference for the notion of the self and its capacity to represent itself to itself. Now let's turn to Sartre. Sartre's existentialist view of the self emphasizes free self-construction. As he says in a famous lecture, Existentialism and Humanism, existentialists think that existence precedes essence, or if you prefer, that subjectivity must be the starting point. When he says that subjectivity must be the starting point, he's actually consciously referring to Descartes, one of the thinkers on the list that I had earlier, one of those foundational figures for turning philosophy's attention toward the self, or turning attention culturally, both in philosophy and literature, toward the self. So Sartre would argue that Descartes had it right, that we start with a self reflecting or meditating to itself what it will be. Sartre, in trying to explain what does he mean by saying existence precedes essence, he uses a famous analogy, or really, to be more strictly accurate, I should say he uses a counter analogy. Because as we'll see, the paper cutter analogy is exactly the opposite of the position he thinks that existentialists take. A paper cutter or pair of scissors or a paper, or what we think of as the paper cutter that's a tabletop thing, is a created artifact that begins as a conception in the mind of the inventor or producer. In this case, the essence or nature precedes the existence of the thing. So the inventor or creator thinks, what I really need is a device that will help me cut paper in a way that gives me clean cuts and the resulting paper that looks good and is cut cleanly. And so the plan of the thing precedes its execution, or in the case of the paper cutter, essence precedes existence. Sartre, as I've said, wants to say this is a counter analogy to what is true for human beings. It's the reverse of what is true. In the case of humans, we are radically free, because there is no prior nature to limit or constrain exercise of free choice. So in our case, existence precedes essence, or what Sartre means by that is we just, as he says, appear on the scene and then define ourselves and begin to construct or constitute or represent ourselves in a certain way. Now, I've got some graphics to kind of represent this, and it shows that Sartre wants to explicitly link the notion of the traditional view of human nature as a theistic concept. The view that essence precedes existence is really the view that God conceives of human beings. He thinks, I want to create beings of a particular kind, and he conceives those in the divine mind. And then in the process of execution, he creates or brings into being a human being. And it's an artifact because like the paper cutter, it is the product of creative productivity. In this case, though, it's a human person, it's us. So according to the traditional theistic understanding, God conceives of us, he defines an essence or nature for us, and then brings us into being. So in that case, essence precedes existence. Sartre rejects that view. The whole claim he wants to make is that existentialism rejects that conception and argues that existence precedes essence. There is no pre-given essence, no creator God. In fact, what we have is a self, a human person, thinking the question, how do I define myself? And indeed, as the arrow of self-projection in the image here suggests, I project a conception of myself, and by my actions, I bring that self into being. So existence on this view precedes or comes before essence or nature. Now, the notion of free self-creation is specifically linked to atheism and the denial of human nature. Sartre offers a historical argument about how this idea emerged. This is again a quote from Existentialism and Humanism. He says, in the 18th century, the atheism of the philosophes, French intellectuals in the 1700s, they discarded the idea of God. They were atheists, but not so much for the notion that essence precedes existence. In other words, the philosophes were atheists. They rejected the conception of God, but they kept a notion of fixed human nature. So on their view, man has a human nature. This human nature, which is the concept of the human, is found in all men, which means that each man is a particular example of a universal concept, man, or the human. Atheistic existentialism, he famously says, which I represent, Sartre speaking here in the first person, is more coherent. It states that if God does not exist, there is at least one being in whom existence precedes essence, a being who exists before he can be defined by any concept, and this being is man. Notice the phrase more coherent than what? Well, there's one obvious possibility that's probably the more likely, and that is he's saying then an atheistic denial of God and retention of human nature, exactly the view of the philosophers he was talking about before the ellipses. So he's criticizing here atheistic existentialism is more consistent than being an atheist and yet claiming that humans still have a nature, because he wants to say there's no God to create human nature. But I think there's a sense also in which Sartre wants to say atheistic existentialism is more consistent than also theistic existentialism, because a theistic existentialism still retains the idea of a creator God and yet argues that we are radically free. And he has in mind thinkers like Kierkegaard. He mentions others in the text, but he has in mind thinkers who are combining these ideas of a creator God and a notion of human freedom and self-definition, the capacity to define ourselves. Now, just to spell out a little more this connection between theism or atheism and human freedom and human self-definition, Sartre concludes that the idea of God has collapsed historically. He follows Nietzsche's claim that that God has died, that Nietzsche declared in his book, Joyful Wisdom or the Gay Science. As a consequence, Sartre argues the idea of human nature also should collapse. As he says in the book Existentialism, there is no human nature since there is no God to conceive it. This means that human self-representation has no pre-given parameters. And this is where he says, I actually paraphrased this comment earlier. He says, man exists, turns up, appears on the scene, and only afterwards defines himself. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. By this sequence of steps, Sartre explicitly concludes that the self is nothing more than its self-representation. The self just is however it defines itself. So remember, that's the starting point that we began with. I was asking the question, what's the relationship between how the self represents itself, or how I think about myself, and what the self actually is? In Sartre, in this comment, we see the collapsing of that distinction. Man is nothing else than his plan. He exists only to the extent that he fulfills himself. He is therefore nothing else than the ensemble of his acts, nothing else than his life. So here, when he talks about the ensemble of his acts, again, he's talking about the relationship between action, well, actually choice and action, and self-definition. The way that the self defines itself is by projecting versions of itself or conceptions or visions of itself, and then executing those in action, like we were talking about earlier, the devil on one shoulder, the angel on the other. Thus, to be human, according to Sartre, and this really is straightforwardly Sartre's famous conception of human freedom, to be human is to artistically create, and the most important human aesthetic creation is, in fact, the self that one is. One creates oneself as a certain sort of self. Okay, are there any limits to self-creation, human self-creation? If there is no human nature to exert prior constraint or restraint on human self-creation, are there any other limitations? Well, Sartre agrees or admits that there are some limitations imposed by the given conditions of the self and its history, what he calls, borrowing from the philosopher Heidegger, facticity. Examples of the limitations imposed by the given conditions of the self would be the circumstances of one's birth. Everyone is born in a particular place at a particular time to a certain set of parents and lives under certain material conditions. And as Sartre wants to say, those things are outside of your ability to choose. You can't do anything about those things, because as you wake up to the task of defining and creating yourself, those are already givens. You can't do anything to erase or alter them. Further, Sartre admits that the world may present obstacles to the self's projects, which then produce what Sartre calls a coefficient of adversity. However, this resistance is not absolute. He thinks the coefficient of adversity is always relative to particular projects that the self has. An example that he gives is that if I'm looking at the Matterhorn and all I want to do is photograph it, the Matterhorn presents a very low coefficient of adversity to my actions and my choices, and in this case, my self-definition as a photographer. By contrast, if I want to be a mountain climber, and my objective is to scale the Matterhorn, so there's the action, scaling the Matterhorn, that is part of a conception of the self, a mountain climber, then the coefficient of adversity is extremely high. So depending on the task or project the self gives itself, the coefficient of adversity and the facticity of the self might present what seem to be limitations. However, Sartre wants to argue that any such limitations are always only relative to the projects the self gives itself. And so there's a sense in which there are no absolute barriers, there are no absolute limits, there are no constraints on the self's representation of itself. I can represent myself in any way whatsoever. This is why Sartre asserts that human freedom is absolute. As he says, the slave in chains is as free as his master. Because what he's trying to argue here in a very paradoxical way, by the way, this is claims like this that Sartre makes are notoriously controversial, because he seems to be saying even the person who is enslaved, even the person who is living under the conditions of slavery, is still radically free, because that person can, of course, that person faces the context of enslavement, but that person can choose however he or she wants to respond to the conditions of enslavement. And so in that, Sartre wants to argue that the self is radically free. Does Sartre really think there is no human nature? I think we have a hint in the subtitle of the book of his magnum opus. I've given you some quotes from his little book, Existentialism and Humanism, which was the transcript of a lecture he gave. But perhaps his most famous book is Being and Nothingness. But he subtitles Being and Nothingness a phenomenological ontology. And notice it's a phenomenological ontology, not a metaphysical ontology. So what is phenomenology? Phenomenology is a branch of philosophy that has to do with representing, it has to do with how being appears to us, and concerns, in a technical way, it concerns thinkers like Husserl and Heidegger and so forth. But the important point for us is that Sartre, I think, in subtitling that, in a way, it's a similar concession to Kierkegaard subtitling The Sickness Unto Death, a psychological account of the self's upbuilding and self-representation. So Sartre would realize I'm not doing metaphysics here in Being and Nothingness, even though I'm using ontological or being-related terms like being and nothingness. He would say what I'm really doing is talking about the phenomenon. I'm talking about phenomenology, especially the phenomenology of the self's understanding of itself. And another reason for thinking this is correct is that in his later work, Sartre admits that he broadly accepts the naturalism or materialism of Marxism and modern science, which means that the human being is material being, as he says in his book, Search for a Method. And he actually spells this out even more thoroughly and more fully in his book, Critique of Dialectical Reason. The one insistence that Sartre would make that makes this consistent with existentialism as humanism is he wants to say, my condition is that as long as materiality is understood in terms that do not reductionistically eliminate human consciousness. So in other words, Sartre would say he is not the kind of materialist who just says that human beings aren't free because all we are is material entities governed by all of the laws of physics. Sartre would reject that, but he wants to say, I have no objection to I see no controversy in yielding to the idea that the self is a material being. Now, where are we post Sartre? I would argue that the contemporary situation gives us what we might call radical Sartreanism. In contemporary popular thought, it doesn't admit limitations on the self's power to construct itself. In other words, what contemporary popular conceptions of self-understanding want to claim is that reality is socially constructed, and thus the only limits to the self's projects of self-definition are imposed through social sanction, either by other individuals or possibly even by the conditions that are created by human social existence, by the fact that we are social beings. And indeed, sometimes this is a theme that we find in a number of existentialists, that social conditions are often constructed by society anonymously. We often say things like, they say that ... by which we mean there's a kind of sense that people have that there's an accepted view out, and that would be a sense in which the only constraint that a radical social constructionist would grant is that that there's this sense imposed by, or at least there's a sense that there are limits imposed by by the social ways that people's identities are limited or defined, often in terms of one's group identity. But if that's the case, if the only limitations are social, and we say that the self has power to even overturn social sanctions, the effect of this is to radically sever human self-representation from any limits whatsoever. And I think this is often where we find ourselves in contemporary culture when we talk about how there are no limits whatsoever on the self's capacity to represent itself to itself. So what I want to suggest here, and by the way, I'm compressing a very complex and really extensive argument here about popular culture and the historical situation we find ourselves in. But I want to claim that the modern view is derived from Sartre, but it abandons even the constraints that Sartre himself concedes, especially in his later works when he's admitting, well, I'm not doing phenomenological ontology, I'm doing a more clear claim about the nature of the human person. So who is right? Kierkegaard, Sartre, or the radical neo-Sartrean project? My view, and the position I want to take to wrap up this talk, is that the project of severing the self's project of self-representation or self-definition from a grounding in human nature, what we might call radical constructionism. So radical constructionism is the view that we can sever the self's project of self-representation from any foundational nature, that we can sever philosophical psychology from philosophical anthropology. I want to argue that it fails. And I really want to just briefly, I know we're getting to the end of the time, I want to leave time for conversation. So I want to just sketch out a couple of reasons for this. First, I think there's a point of rhetorical consistency. The main thinker that's associated with the radical notion of constructionism is Sartre, and he doesn't even hold the view that's often attributed to him. Often in human nature classes, for example, the claim is given that Sartre is, in a way, an interesting figure to include in a human nature class because he's an anti-human nature theorist. He claims there is no nature. But as we've pointed out, Sartre admits that what he's doing when he's making those claims is he's offering an existential phenomenological psychology, or a phenomenological ontology. Sartre himself acknowledges that there is, in fact, an underlying ontology or nature to the self-representation, although in his case, he says it's materialism. It's the materialism of Marxism and modern science. I want to argue that radical constructionism is then, to borrow Sartre's ethical concept, the ultimate form of bad faith, or mauvaise foi. Actually, hang on just a second. Okay, right. I thought there was a, no, I thought I skipped a slide, but it's coming up here. So, okay. Bad faith is, Sartre's view of bad faith is self-deception about the conditions for human freedom. For Sartre, since there is no human nature, there are no inherent constraints or limits. So human freedom is absolute or complete. The only limitations imposed by the self are those that the self imposes on itself. So to engage in bad faith is to lie to oneself that one is not free, that one is compelled by some determinism, as he says in Existentialism and Humanism, to pursue a path of choice and action. However, I would argue the ultimate bad faith, I would argue that radical constructionism is an instance of Sartrean bad faith, because the ultimate form of bad faith or self-deception is to conclude from the fact that one has the liberty to choose any project for oneself, that one should think of oneself as having the power to achieve any project one might set for oneself. That is to say, ignoring the metaphysical conditions of one's action is perhaps the most fundamental form of bad faith. Further, radical constructionism is amoral. Sartrean self-creation has as its only criterion authenticity, that is, the consistency of the self with itself. It's undeniable that some potentially consistent projects of selfhood, such as drug addiction, performative antisocial behavior, or genocidal racial identity politics, are immoral and in some cases self-destructive. In other words, you can be a terrible person in any of these ways, but be consistent in defining yourself in those ways. What this tells us is that an ethical outlook should be logically consistent, but consistency alone is not sufficient for a successful ethic. It is a sufficient condition, but it's not enough to have a good ethic. Actually, no, I got that reversed. It's a necessary. Did I write that wrong? It's alone. It's not sufficient, right? So consistency is a necessary criterion, but alone it's not sufficient. Further, let's see. Okay, right, here we go. The human experience of freedom, Sartre argues that constructionist conception of the self is the only one which gives man dignity, the only one which does not reduce him to an object. The effect of all materialism is to treat all men, including the one philosophizing, as objects, that is, as an ensemble of determined reactions in no way distinguished from the ensemble of qualities and phenomena which constitute a table or a chair or a stone. So in other words, what Sartre's arguing is only a radical anti-nature conception of the self is sufficient for giving the self dignity. Now, I want to point out that this argument is at least ironic in the light of Sartre's embrace of materialism in his later works. So he's saying here that atheistic existentialism and that consists in a radical conception of the self's self-construction or self-definition is the only one that grants the self-dignity because it's an anti-materialist doctrine. That's quite ironic, given that Sartre himself admitted in his later works that he was operating with a materialist outlook. Further, it ignores possible accounts of human freedom that are not framed in terms of radical constructionism. For example, I could give Descartes' or Kierkegaard's. Further, constructionism affirms human freedom only in what I would call a quixotic way, completely detached from reality. However, while humans do have the freedom to represent the self to itself, that freedom is in fact grounded in our specific biological, social, and cultural conditions. To go back to Kierkegaard's way of putting this, we are only able to represent ourselves to ourselves because we are organisms of a certain particular kind. Finally, radical constructionism is anti-realist. While anti-realist arguments concerning social constructionism are now very popular in modern thought, in modern ethics, social thought, and even philosophy of science, they're not obviously true, I would say. Popular conceptions of the success of science involve an implicit commitment to realism insofar as successful science gets the world right. At the very least, radical constructionism posits stipulatively that anti-realism is true and that realism is mistaken, but it doesn't argue for that, or it certainly doesn't establish the truth of anti-realism or an anti-realist conception of reality. I also have theological concerns. Radical constructionism is both suggested by and consistent with a narrative of secularization and the death of God. We saw how Sartre explicitly makes that argument. However, one can acknowledge the phenomenon of secularization without conceding the truth of atheism. Theological claims retain great explanatory power, even in a culture that is defined by increasing secularization, as, for example, the Christian notion of original sin. And I would argue in particular that Kierkegaard's analysis of despair as problematic, a problem of both psychology and spirituality, offers a rich account of human striving and pathology. And so it isn't at all obvious to me, for all kinds of reasons, not only the self's capacity to define itself, that we should give into this conception because it's linked to a conception of secularization and atheism. So my conclusion, a standard modern way of thinking of self-definition or self-representation severs it from limits in human nature. I want to argue, I've tried to argue, there are clear problems with this view. And further, I want to argue that a rich account of the human condition requires attention to both the power of the self to represent itself to itself, philosophical psychology, and the underlying conditions of human existence, or philosophical anthropology. As we normally do in the Socratic Club, I would like to open up our conversation. Questions, comments, discussion. If you're so inclined, you could turn on your cameras. It'd be nice to see the folks we're talking to. So I'd like to offer, if there are students who would like to ask a question first, I have two of my colleagues here, and I know that we could talk endlessly, but I'm curious if a student present has a question. If you'd prefer not to turn on your camera, that's fine. You can type a comment or turn on your mic and ask a question. Any student like to ask a question? Clarification question. Well, maybe I'll let my colleagues ask a question, and we'll see if that spurs some further questions or discussion. Anyone?
Can I jump in before Dwayne?
You got to be quick, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, probably. I might have numerous questions, but I would like to start here because you want to say that, in a certain sense, Sartre doesn't stand by his own claim, or at least the claim that many other Sartreans do, because he has this explicit commitment to materialism later. But of course, materialism isn't necessarily the same thing as physicalism, right? And so in other words, is it a social theory or is it a theory about bodies? Would that matter? What does materialism mean for Sartre?
Wow, that's a good question that I wish I'd done reading recently on, so I'm not as up on this as I would like to be. But I think it's true that, of course, Sartre's primary point of reference is Marxism, especially in his later works. So he's thinking about materialism as an account, really, of the unfolding of material conditions that define society. So yeah, I think you're right that he's thinking of it as a theory about I could call it a kind of philosophical developmental theory about human social arrangements. I don't think, though, that he's resistant to the idea of thinking. I mean, he does say the phrase he uses in I forget if it's Lectures on Method, I think. He says that a human person is a material being. I think he doesn't have any problem with thinking of us in terms of our materiality as basically as organisms. As long as that isn't understood, as I said, as long as it's understood not to mean something like deterministic materialism or deterministic or reductionistic materialism. So in other words, he wants to say there is actually a foundational ontology. The world does have a kind of metaphysical nature. And I'm perfectly happy with saying, I think Sartre would say, I'm perfectly happy with saying it's a material nature. And of course, he is going to say that working out details of what that looks like is importantly for him going to connect with a Marxist project of understanding the material emergence of of a social conception that human beings have as a result of existing in material conditions like capitalism and so forth. But for our purposes, I think the point is he's not denying that there is a metaphysical reality or an ontology that underlies the self's creation or the self's definition of itself. I think for that, what we have to turn to is more modern conceptions that I would argue are kind of radical forms of Sartreanism that take Sartre in directions perhaps that are implicit in Sartre, but certainly go beyond admissions that Sartre is willing to make in his own work, that he's willing to make in his own work. But I might turn that around and ask my colleagues, who probably know at least as much and perhaps more Marx than I do, if they'd have anything further to say about that. Other comments, questions? Dwayne has a comment.
Hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thanks so much. I loved it. We've talked a lot about this for almost 10 years now. Is this fair to say? So I wrote this down because I want to make sure this is what I think you're saying. And if it's wrong, let me know where it's wrong. It sounds like what the gist of it is that genuine freedom, and you said this more at the end, it needs the sort of constraints of essence or teleology or essentialism or hylomorphism, whatever. Otherwise, the pure kind of Sartrean freedom sort of drains all the meaning out of freedom. Is that fair to say? Is that what you're saying? Otherwise, because it's kind of condemnation to be free. You really can't ever be anything. You're always in a kind of perpetual bad faith. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I do. As a matter of fact, I think that it's correct. And my grounds for really saying it would have to do with I think actually thinking about the way that specifically the way Kierkegaard talks about the exercise of human freedom is that freedom is always exercised within a context. And so, I mean, even when I was talking before to go totally cliche or popular culture about this, the angel and the devil sitting on my shoulder, right? I have to be able to conceive of possibilities. And I think what Sartre, even in the radical conception of freedom, and I think actually a reason why, if we actually push him on this, he would actually be more comfortable talking about this in Marxist terms, to say, well, the possibilities that are open to us are only possibilities that are conceivable within the material and social conditions that we exist, right? So it is true that we can, and I actually use the word quixotic, right, from Don Quixote, we can sort of imagine possibilities that are completely outside of the realm of our experience in a way that I think science fiction authors sometimes try to stretch at doing. But notice even science fiction authors end up borrowing from the world as we know it, right? So they alter elements of the world, they reconstruct elements, they extend elements of the world, but they're still working within a kind of context that would be at least understandable to a person in our culture, in our material circumstances. And so I think it is correct that a notion of a self that absolutely had no constraints, I wonder if this would be, the famous example of Buridan's ass, right, who has difficulty choosing between two equal choices that are in a sense equally reasonable, right, that it becomes a trap. Well, I think we could imagine that an infinite array of radical possibilities would be totally paralyzing to a self. In other words, the self, it couldn't even, I think it's probably fair to say that the self wouldn't even begin the task of selfhood, because it wouldn't even be able to embark on the project of considering the possibilities of oneself rather than another.
Yeah, maybe this is asking you to answer. I know you said in there you didn't want to go into why you think Kierkegaard is a hylomorphist, but I'm curious, how does a human being having an essential nature in the Aristotelian sense, how does that add to that? Because I agree with you. I think he's more amenable to that than most readers of Kierkegaard think. But how would that, don't I think, and I haven't quite figured out how to work this out. I think that adds to freedom in a different way. I mean, this is basic, this is the Christian tradition that somehow having an essential nature, whether it's the rational animal in the Aristotelian sense or whatever, adds to the meaning of what freedom is. You think that's the case?
Yeah, I do. I would say that, I mean, of course, in the case, I'm actually more prepared to talk about that with respect to Kierkegaard than with respect to Aristotle. But I think Aristotle would say to be an organism of a certain kind, while it's limiting, it means that certain kinds of possibilities are open before me as well, right? So, and in fact, I think this is related even to those social conditions that I think that what we might call the more tame Sartre would agree with, right? That my social conditions, even to think in Marxist terms, right? I can be, given my social conditions, I can be a capitalist or a worker. I can be, those are things that I'm capable of conceiving and even of entertaining as live possibilities, in part because I've seen them actually instantiated in others. And so there's a sense in which I think if we can connect this back to Aristotle and say that being a being of a certain kind means that I'm able to see how beings like me, beings that have a certain kind of nature, how they engage their capacity for freedom and pursue, and in some cases we might say struggle against the limitations of their nature. You think of people who face extraordinarily difficulties, like very difficult conditions of youth and upbringing, abusive parents, for example, or severe physical handicaps as a result of congenital diseases or some such, right? That we're able to see that people who face difficulties are able to see ways of constructing a path forward, a conception of the self that admits those limitations, that recognizes those limitations, and yet still exercises a free range of possibilities that are possible despite those limitations.
Thanks.
So I can't see anybody. So I don't know if I'm stepping on someone's. I can't even see David. I see myself, and everyone else is a black box because my Zoom's.
You might turn your video on and off. And sometimes just resetting it will get you to work again.
So before my thing totally craps out, I just wanted to ask quickly. I would say, okay, let's buy that only a being that is of such and such a nature can do something like represent itself to itself. But we find that humans can do this, presumably angels can do this, presumably demons can do this, presumably God can do this, and yet the nature of God, the nature of angels, the nature of humans, quite distinct. So what would keep us from being a Sartrean by saying, okay, well, there must be some nature that allows me to do that. But in order for me to say what I want to say, I don't have to be clear on what that nature is, because obviously 3 or 4 different natures are possible that would let me do such a thing.
That's an interesting question. I'll honestly say it's not one that I thought about before. I do wonder, though, let me try this as a possibility. Of course, in Christian thought, the notion of the human person as imaging God or being created in the image of God might suggest that there are certain what we might call functional dimensions to the power of self-creation. In other words, what I notice is that it might, I'm actually thinking here of Descartes. Descartes says famously in Meditation 4 that even though we're unlike God in many ways, we share with God the power of an unlimited will. And he wants to argue that might be the way that we should think of ourselves as having, as bearing the divine image, insofar as we have the capacity for choosing. and that our choosing is, as he says, unlimited or infinite. It is not finite. It does not admit of any bounds. But of course, Descartes would say that doesn't mean I'm the same as God, even though I share with God an infinite capacity to choose. I exercise that infinite capacity to choose from a particular point of view or from a particular metaphysical context. And so my free self-creation always operates out of the conditions of my existence. I know that Tyler and I have a long conversation going about whether God is constrained by his nature. And Tyler wants to argue for a radically voluntarist conception of God, where God is not constrained in any way. Well, I think that would really be interesting, because that would show us the respect in which God's perfect. If we grant that possibility, right, that might be a way in which we would say God is perfect in a way that we are not, that God can exercise his freedom in a completely unconstrained way. And so an interesting implication of that might be that Sartre is actually right about radical self-creation, but only for one entity, namely God. God is the only being that exercises radical self-creation of the sort that Sartre conceives. Other beings like us that are constrained by material circumstances, our freedom is always bounded in certain ways by the kinds of things that we are. Now, I want to take this in another direction that I think is very important. I haven't very much talked about Kierkegaard's diagnosis of the human condition as suffering despair. I just sketched it out and said, that's not really what this talk is about. But I want to argue that actually this is where that's relevant, that Kierkegaard would say, do we have the freedom to choose projects that are insanely out of keeping with our nature? Absolutely. But what do those involve? Those are the definition of despair. We can choose all kinds of projects that are not in keeping with the kinds of things that we are. But those are inevitably going to lead us to this sense of a self that despises itself, a self that wants to get rid of itself but cannot. Those are all ways that Kierkegaard describes the self in despair. I think it's interesting too. You mentioned angels and demons, angels and devils. I'm not so sure. I think angels would be more like us because they exercise a kind of will. But of course, I mean, there's all kinds of controversies about angelology, about exactly how we should conceive of angels. If angels are constrained by having a nature that simply is an expression of the will of God, then they are very constrained. The hitch here, of course, is at least a very popular conception of the nature of angels and the nature of demons, that demons are fallen angels, that demons are angels who have exercised their will and their wills in certain kinds of ways. And I wonder if we just, let's grant that for a moment, the sort of classic Miltonian way of thinking about the nature of angels is that devils are fallen angels. They exercise their will, even though generally speaking, they are just extensions of the divine will. But if their will can be exercised in such a way that they can defy the divine will, that's what a devil is. That's what demons are. I think what's interesting is a Kierkegaardian analysis would actually hold here, that their diabolical existence is this existence of a self that is conceiving of and projecting itself in such a way that is ultimately self-destructive, that is ultimately self-undermining. In other words, demons suffer the worst kind of despair at all. There is a theme in Kierkegaard that argues that uses the category of what Kierkegaard calls the demonic. And I think this may be what he has in mind here, an exercise of will that tries to be completely unconstrained. That would be the demonic, and that would be a particular kind of despair that I would argue, you could actually argue Kierkegaard foresaw what I've called radical Sartreanism here, the notion that the self the self is under no constraints whatsoever in its self-projecting or self-defining. I said a lot there. There's probably something someone can pick up on or raise a question or pursue a clarification about. No?
I had something to say, but I forgot now.
Well, it may go back to, remember Tyler's original question had to do with, is it true that there are multiple ways, right? That's basically what you're getting at, that there are multiple ways to exercise, there are multiple grounds
Surely
of being that ground a kind of, the kind of freedom that allows for self-definition.
Yeah, surely there are entities that represent themselves to themselves that do not have hylomorphous at their basis, which means that hylomorphism cannot be the sole ontology that would make representing oneself to oneself possible. And if that's so, then why would we need to be tethered to that?
Couldn't we just say, well, wouldn't you? Yeah, so I see your point, but just take away the hule there. A being that has a morphe, any being that has an essence or a form would be able to do that, right? Or no?
Well, or what I was suggesting with the connection to Descartes is only beings that have forms that involve wills. And it has to be the kind of will that allows for, it has to be a cognitive or intellective will that allows for the self to be able to represent itself to itself. That is, to conceive of itself, right? And I mean, the easy contrast to this is animals, right? Animals have a kind of conscious awareness. Many higher animals have a kind of conscious awareness, but as far as we can tell, they don't have anything like a capacity to represent themselves to themselves. So what that means is there's a sense in which I'm also now I'm thinking of Walker Percy's way of talking about this, that he wants to actually say the capacity to represent yourself to yourself is actually the conditions required for the fall, the separation of the self from itself. Because the ability to represent yourself to yourself means that you can conceive of a self that you are not, right? And you can see that self that you are not as a project that you can yourself identify with, hence the idea of the fall. So the self falls from itself by being able to represent itself to itself. So only beings, I'm willing to agree with Walker Percy on this point and say the only beings for whom this is possible is beings that potentially are capable of falling from themselves by creating an alienation or a gap of the self from itself.
So is this a difference in kind or degree? That is to say, are there beings that represent themselves to themselves and then those that don't? Or do some do it more completely and some less completely? Because I, of course, have many opaque spots where I don't bring myself to full self-representation. Is this a difference of degree or kind?
That's another really good question. Because, I mean, I'm thinking here now about research in animal intelligence, and we know that there are animals, great apes have minimal forms of self-awareness. In other words, one of the classic tests for this in animal cognition is you put a spot of paint on the forehead of an animal, and what a great ape will do is, if you put them in front of a mirror and they've got a spot of paint, they'll look at the mirror image and they'll actually touch the spot of paint, as if to say, I know that's me in the mirror, and I know that there's something there that normally I don't see when I see my image in a mirror. Now, that's okay. That's a minimal power of recognizing that the image that I see in the mirror is the self that I am, is the entity that I am. I'm not sure that that's identical to the capacity for representing the self to itself. In other words, I might be able to recognize the self that I see in a mirror image as the self that I am. But I think what's required for the kind of thing that we're talking about, for having a self in the robust sense, for being spirit, as Kierkegaard calls it, for engaging in the kind of self-representation that can lead to an alienation of the self from itself, I think that has to do with a much more expansive power of the self to conceive of a self that it could be, and to take on the project of trying to activate or actualize that self. So I suspect that that's really what's required for the kinds of beings that we're talking about. And I don't know, it's interesting to think again about the case of angels, right? If we think of angels as extensions of the divine will, I'm not sure that they can represent themselves to themselves in this way, where in other words, they think of options or different ways that they could be. I'm not sure that that's accurate. If so, it would suggest that the very popular theological view that views demons as fallen angels is at least problematic. Because if I'm right in thinking that angels are nothing more than extensions of the divine will, they can't really represent themselves as selves that are opposed to the divine will. And that's what would be required for an angel to fall. But I mean, this is way outside of my area of expertise. I am not an angelologist. Where's John Wagner when you need him? Other comments, questions? Maybe one of the students, anything that we've said, maybe sparked a question for you? Tyler, did you find what I said satisfactory in any way? Do you think so? So we can maybe talk about a certain range of natures that can possibly represent them to themselves, but there may be a very limited number that would require certain kinds of capacities. It has to involve will. It has to involve intellection or cognition. It has to involve the capacity to consider possible futures and so forth. So we might say, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm wondering about the particular features that, or the categories that Kierkegaard lists as the poles of the synthesis of the self, right? So the kind of self that can represent itself has to have a capacity of infinitude, of seeing possibility, a capacity of finitude, of operating out of, this is what you were saying earlier, Dwayne, of operating out of a limited or defined context. It has to have a notion of temporality, but it has to understand itself as not limited by temporality, so a dimension of eternality. It has to have a dimension of necessity. I am a thing, and yet I am possibly a thing other than I am. So it has to be not completely crushed by its necessity. By the way, in the same way that I think Sartre would say he's okay with materialism as long as it's not a deterministic materialism. I think the same thing would hold there. So maybe those are, I don't even know if Kierkegaard was thinking about the question in the way that you're suggesting, but I think it's fascinating that those categories that he thought of as the dialectical opposites, those might be the conditions that specify what a self has to have, is this dynamic dialectic between conditions of openness and conditions of limitation, which would go back to Dwayne's point that that limitation is required. A being that had no limitations whatsoever would be paralyzed by possibility and thus would not be able to constitute the self as a self. Although I don't know then what this would mean, Tyler, for your conception of God as a radically voluntaristic conception of God, that he's not constrained by anything, including his own nature.
Ooh, Dave, can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to check because when you said angels couldn't be demons or demons couldn't be angels, there is a passage in Revelation 12 that says the dragon and his angels fought against Michael and his angels. So there's a tradition. I think that's the only line, or in the book of Revelation is the only line, the idea that Satan has his own messengers. It's probably messenger in Greek. I don't know. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
Well, that there actually is a biblical tradition that it's grounded on, and it's very obscure passages in, if I'm remembering correctly, Kings and Chronicles, about prophecies about, or no, maybe it's Jeremiah, about the fallen king of Babylon. And it's clear as you get into the way the prophet is talking, he's not just talking about a human king that was overthrown or something like that, because it's talking about a being that is cast down from heaven. And at least that's the biblical referent is where at least some of this theological idea of demons or devils as fallen angels comes from. But again, I'm not an expert on this. I was just in my Christianity and Science class. We were talking about Newton, who, although known for being a physicist and mathematician, was also really interested in biblical prophecy and numerology. And he probably would have had all kinds of things to say about this. So, we not only where's John Wagner when you need him, but where's Newton when you need him?
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
And this is maybe to Tyler too, to see what you both have to say about this, but I know Sartre, and I like that he does this with freedom. He connects freedom with nothingness and secreting nothingness. And I think he means that literally. And because I think he takes it from Heidegger. There's something about the ability to be able to separate myself from myself requires a differentiation or a kind of literal space of nothing between things. Like every determination is negation. So this activity of negating. And my question is, and I know Tyler, does Schelling in this, and this has to be, Heidegger had to have gotten this from Schelling, this idea that freedom and the awareness of nothing are related. And then the question becomes, well, okay, if that's the case, then is there this nothing in God? And then what does it mean to say that that nothingness has ontological status in the divine? You see, does this make sense? And I know, so yeah, I just wanted to ask this kind of crazy question while the two of you are here.
Maybe Tyler should answer that question.
Oh dear. Well, I would be inclined to agree, namely that yes, nothingness is essential to freedom. That yes, humans and angels and gods are free. Hence, nothingness is essential to all of them. Hence why when Dr. Calhoun was talking earlier about if angels are just an expression of God's will, then maybe they can't, be radically otherwise or can't fall. And that's what triggered in my mind that, well, then so much the worse for God. He must be less free than even the angels. And in fact, man is the freest of them all because I can do that. But that I don't actually think that, right? But that, yeah, there is a certain nothingness even in God. And, however we want to think about this, we could do it a million different ways maybe, but this is why at least I would be comfortable with distinguishing between Godhead and God, or making that kind of distinction, which not everyone is familiar with. There's the abyss in God called Godhead, and then there's God in his personhood that has something to overcome, namely himself, his own void, as it were.
Yeah, that's cool.
To go back to, I feel like I'm more qualified to talk about the human application of the point you're making. And I think that, of course, I sometimes say the best stuff in Sartre is stolen from Heidegger, who steals it from Kierkegaard. And this idea, I think, you do find that's what I think Kierkegaard is claiming in The Sickness Unto Death, that there's a sense in which the self has to, there's a passage in The Sickness where Kierkegaard talks about the self alienating itself from itself, right? And so what he means by that is there's a sense in which the self has to fall from itself. And this goes back to what we said earlier. The self has to be a self means that you have to have this capacity to divide the self from itself. But it also means that there is, as you say, there's a kind of negation in the self itself, that I have to realize that there's well, you can put it in these terms, that I am not the self that I am, or I am the self that I am not, right? So negation can happen either of those ways. So where you realize, I mean, this is what happens to us in moments of waking up to our existential freedom, that we realize, well, I have always been, I don't know, you can imagine, well, people who have conversions, this is one of the reasons why I'm really interested in the phenomenon of conversion, is a person who converts has this experience of negativity, I would say, right? The person would say, I have always been a Muslim, or I've always been a Christian, or I've always been a Buddhist. And what I realize now is, I think there's a really dramatic phrase in an essay by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is an ex-Muslim, who she says, and it's interesting, based on my example earlier about great ape self-recognition, there was a time where she gradually realized, I'm drifting away from Islam. And then one day she looked in a mirror, in a mirror of her bathroom mirror, and said, she looked at herself and said, you aren't a Muslim anymore. And so what she was doing there is, she found it extraordinarily difficult, because of the culture she was raised in, to create that negativity, to create that nothingness, that gap between the self that she was and the self that she was increasingly conceiving herself to be. And she had to dramatically she almost had to exercise, or how would I put this? She had to engage in a willed action that posited the negation of the self that she was from the identity that she no longer identified with.
Yeah, that's two things. Can I say something just quick?
Sure.
Augustine's notion of the Trinity seems to have that kind of self-reflection built into it, that the Father reflects upon himself, and that reflection is the Son, and the willed relation between that is the Spirit. And the other thing you brought up about the concept of anxiety, Kierkegaard does seem to want to say, but he doesn't say it outright, that freedom or anxiety arises as dreaming spirit with the prohibition. So we're told not to do something, and then we're struck in anxiety, and then that's an awareness of spirit and dreaming spirit.
Or even that sounds like I've been reading Romans recently, where Paul says, freedom didn't really exist until the command was given, and then sin sprang into life, right? Sin sprang to life. And so I was able to conceive of myself as eating the fruit from the tree, precisely because I was commanded not to eat the fruit from the tree.
Exactly. Yeah, it's kind of neat.
Interesting, not somewhat segue, but we were talking with my child, my 8-year-old Felix, about this the other day, and Luke was coming upstairs. This, doesn't care if Felix is in his underwear at all. But he's like, "Oh, Luke's coming up. I got to put my clothes back on." And so we were talking with him about how he didn't realize he was naked until Luke was going to come upstairs. Segue, he's naked in the bathtub now, and I need to go get him out of the bathtub. So,
well, it is time for us to quit. Hey, thanks to folks who came to this rescheduled session of the Gonzaga Socratic Club. Thanks to all of you. Stay tuned. We have a great presentation on hylomorphism and contemporary philosophy of mind coming up in later this month in March, on Monday the 21st, if I'm remembering my dates right. And then we have a session on human nature and divinization, or the condition of the human person after death, basically, is what it's all about. So stay tuned for that. So thanks again for coming. Have a great night, everyone. Take care.